"We're not a shelter, Mom." My son said those 6 words while rainwater dripped from the edge of my coat onto his front porch, and somehow they hurt more than losing my apartment that morning. I stood there holding the handle of an old blue suitcase with fingers so cold I could barely feel them anymore. The porch light above Brian's garage flickered once in the wind, casting shadows across his face. And for a moment, I searched for the little boy who used to cry whenever I left him alone at kindergarten. But all I saw was a tired man standing beside a warm house that no longer had room for me. Melissa stood a few feet behind him near the hallway entrance, one hand wrapped around a ceramic mug. She didn't say anything at first. She just leaned lightly against the wall in her cream-colored sweater while soft music drifted from somewhere inside the house. I could smell garlic bread and tomato sauce from their kitchen. Dinner had already started without me. "I only need a week," I said quietly. "The flooding damaged the whole first floor. They said the repairs might take several days." Brian rubbed the back of his neck the way he always did when he wanted to escape a difficult conversation. "Mom, the kids already have enough disruption right now." I glanced past him into the house. The living room looked warm and golden against the storm outside. A blanket was folded over the couch. The television glowed softly in the corner. Lucy's pink sneakers sat near the stairs beside a tiny umbrella covered in cartoon strawberries. It looked like every ordinary family evening I had spent years imagining I would still belong to when I got older. Melissa finally spoke, her voice calm and careful in that way people use when they want to sound reasonable while saying something cruel. "We just think boundaries are important, Helen." Boundaries. Funny how younger people always use soft words for hard things. I tightened my grip on the suitcase handle and nodded slowly as though I understood. Maybe I did. Maybe this moment had started years ago, long before the floodwater reached my apartment building. Maybe it started the first Thanksgiving Melissa suggested they spend the holiday with her family instead. Or the Christmas Brian forgot to call until almost midnight. Or the time Lucy's school concert happened, and I only found out because I saw pictures online afterward. Families rarely fall apart all at once. Usually it happens quietly. One missed invitation at a time. One uncomfortable silence after another. Rain blew sideways across the porch and soaked the bottom of my slacks. My overnight bag sat beside me with a pharmacy envelope sticking out of the side pocket. I suddenly became aware of how old I must have looked standing there. A 71-year-old widow carrying luggage in the middle of November like someone with nowhere else to go. Brian glanced toward the kitchen behind him. I noticed he still couldn't fully look me in the eye. "There's a motel about 10 minutes from here," he said. "Near the interstate." I smiled then. Not because I felt happy. Because sometimes smiling is the only way to stop your dignity from cracking right in front of people who have already decided you're a burden. "Of course," I said softly. I didn't mean to interrupt dinner. Melissa nodded once as if relieved the conversation was ending peacefully. That hurt more than anger would have. Anger at least leaves evidence of love underneath it. Relief means they were waiting for you to leave. Somewhere upstairs, I heard Lucy laughing. The sound floated down through the stairwell bright and innocent, untouched by whatever this moment was becoming. Brian opened the storm door wider, but not for me. Just enough to step outside onto the porch. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a folded $50 bill. "For the motel," he muttered. I stared at the money in his hand. 20 years ago, after his business failed, I sold my wedding jewelry to help him make his mortgage payment. I never told Melissa. I never even told Brian how much I sacrificed because mothers aren't supposed to keep score. We're supposed to give. Quietly. Constantly. Endlessly. But standing there in the cold rain while my son offered me motel money like I was a stranger stranded at a gas station, something inside me finally grew tired. Not angry. Just tired. "Keep it," I said gently. "You have children to take care of." He looked embarrassed then, and for one brief second I thought maybe he might tell me to come inside after all. Maybe he would remember who I was before age turned me into an inconvenience. But Melissa touched his arm lightly, and whatever fragile thought had crossed his face disappeared. "Drive carefully," she said, as though I were leaving after a pleasant visit. I picked up my suitcase and overnight bag. The wheels rattled awkwardly over the wet porch boards as I turned toward the driveway. Behind me, the warm yellow light from their doorway stretched across the rain like something I almost still belonged to. Then the door closed softly. Not slammed. Not violently. Just gently enough to make it clear the decision had already been made long before tonight. I stood there for a moment beside my old Buick while rain tapped steadily against the roof of the car. The porch light clicked off automatically behind me, leaving the house dark and distant. And that was the moment I realized my son hadn't stopped loving me all at once. He had simply been learning, little by little, how to live without me. I drove for nearly 20 minutes before I realized I had been gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my fingers ached. Rain streaked across the windshield in silver lines while the old wipers dragged back and forth with a tired squeaking sound that reminded me how long I had owned this car. The interstate was almost empty except for a few tractor-trailers and the occasional headlights rushing past in the darkness. My suitcase slid slightly across the back seat every time I turned a corner. Beside it sat a framed photograph of Frank that I had grabbed from my apartment before the floodwater ruined everything on the lower shelves. In the picture, he stood beside Brian at a Little League game wearing that proud smile fathers get when they think their sons will grow into good men. I wondered what Frank would have said if he had been standing on that porch tonight. Maybe nothing. Frank had always believed people eventually revealed themselves without needing to be confronted. The motel Brian mentioned sat just beyond a gas station and a shuttered diner with a faded sign missing 2 letters. Vacancy glowed weakly in red neon above the office window. The parking lot smelled like wet asphalt and cigarette smoke. I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment listening to the ticking sound beneath the hood while rain tapped softly against the roof of the Buick. Everything felt strangely quiet after the conversation at Brian's house. Not peaceful quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after something important breaks inside you. The motel clerk looked barely old enough to rent a car. He wore headphones around his neck and barely glanced up from his phone when I walked inside, dragging my suitcase behind me. "One night?" he asked. "Maybe 2, I answered. Saying the words out loud made my chest tighten unexpectedly. I had spent 43 years building homes. First with Frank, then alone after he passed away. And now here I was deciding between 1 night or 2 in a roadside motel beside Interstate 84 while a young man with acne handed me a plastic key card and pointed toward room 16. The heater inside the room rattled loudly every few minutes like it was struggling to stay alive. The bedspread smelled faintly of bleach. A lamp near the window flickered whenever the heater kicked on. I placed my overnight bag on the small table and slowly removed my coat, hanging it carefully over the chair even though there was no reason to bother. Old habits survive long after dignity starts wearing thin. My shoes left damp marks across the carpet. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked around the room. 1 narrow bed, 1 microwave, 1 framed painting of a sailboat hanging crooked above the television. Temporary places always look the same, like nobody was ever supposed to stay long enough to matter there. I reached for my phone almost automatically. No missed calls. No messages from Brian saying he regretted what happened. No text from Melissa pretending to feel guilty. Nothing. Outside, headlights moved across the curtains each time a car entered the parking lot. I leaned back slowly against the pillow and closed my eyes. But instead of sleeping, memories started arriving one after another in that quiet, relentless way they do when your heart finally stops defending someone. Brian at 7 years old standing beside the kitchen counter in dinosaur pajamas because he had a nightmare during a thunderstorm. Brian at 12 pretending not to cry after striking out during a baseball game while Frank drove us home through heavy summer rain. Brian at 19 hugging me so tightly after his father's funeral that I could barely breathe. "I do not know what I would do without you, Mom," he whispered back then. Funny how people can mean something completely when they say it and still grow into someone unrecognizable later. I opened my eyes and stared at the ceiling tiles above me. Somewhere nearby, a toilet flushed through the thin motel walls. A television laughed loudly in another room. Life continuing around strangers. I suddenly realized I had not eaten dinner. The thought felt distant, almost unimportant. Still, I walked over to the vending machine outside because routine sometimes keeps grief from swallowing you whole. The machine hummed loudly beneath the ice maker. I bought a small pack of peanut butter crackers and a bottle of water. Back inside the room, I sat cross-legged near the headboard, eating slowly, while local news played softly on the television without sound. Flood damage downtown. Holiday traffic expected this weekend. A smiling weatherwoman pointing toward another storm arriving Monday. Ordinary things. The kind of ordinary things that continue no matter whose heart got quietly shattered that evening. Around midnight, My phone finally buzzed. For one foolish second, hope rose inside me before I looked at the screen. It was not Brian. It was Lucy. Her small face appeared beside the message bubble from the last photograph I had taken with her at the pumpkin patch in October. "Grandma, are you okay? Dad said your apartment had problems." I stared at the words for a long time. Then another message appeared. "Are you coming over tomorrow?" I looked toward the rain sliding down the motel window and suddenly felt more exhausted than I had in years. Not because of the flood, not because of the motel, because somewhere along the way my granddaughter had become the only person in that family still wondering where I belonged. The motel coffee tasted like burned cardboard, but I drank 2 cups anyway because the warmth gave my hands something to hold on to besides disappointment. Morning light pushed weakly through the thin curtains while trucks rumbled along the interstate outside. I had barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Brian standing in that doorway with his wallet in his hand, like I was someone asking for bus fare outside a grocery store. Around 7:30, I walked across the parking lot carrying my phone and sat inside my Buick while the heater slowly pushed cold air through the vents. The sky had turned the pale gray color that always reminded me of old photographs. My apartment manager had left a voicemail overnight explaining that the water damage was worse than expected. Pipes burst in 3 units. Flooring ruined. Electrical inspections delayed. Maybe 2 weeks before anyone could safely move back in. Maybe longer. I listened twice before setting the phone down carefully in my lap. 2 weeks. Funny how quickly life can reduce itself into measurements like that. 2 weeks without a home. 2 weeks of deciding where to sit, where to sleep, where to place your toothbrush so it does not feel temporary. I started the car and drove toward downtown without really knowing where I intended to go. The streets were still wet from the storm. American flags outside storefronts hung heavy and motionless in the damp morning air. People hurried into coffee shops carrying briefcases and umbrellas, while holiday decorations already glowed in shop windows, even though Thanksgiving was still days away. Everyone looked like they belonged somewhere. I stopped at a red light beside Franklin Elementary School just as parents began dropping off children. Small backpacks bounced against little shoulders while crossing guards waved cars forward. Watching them brought back a memory so suddenly that it almost hurt physically. Brian at 8 years old refusing to let go of my hand on his first day after we moved to Ohio. He had been terrified of starting over in a new school. Frank was traveling for work that week, so it was just me standing there beside him under cold October rain while he tried not to cry in front of the other children. "You will always have a place with me," I told him that morning. I remember kneeling to zip up his coat while leaves blew across the sidewalk around us. No matter what happens. Back then, I believed children remembered promises like that forever. I parked outside a small diner near Main Street around 9 o'clock and ordered oatmeal I barely touched. An older couple sat 2 booths away sharing pancakes and reading sections of the newspaper aloud to each other. The man wore suspenders. The woman kept refilling his coffee before he asked. Little ordinary acts of caring. The kind that become invisible when you still have them. My phone buzzed again while I stared out the window at passing traffic. Another message from Lucy. "Grandma, are you mad at Dad?" I smiled sadly at the screen. Children always sense the truth long before adults admit it aloud. I typed slowly. "No, sweetheart. Adults just get confused sometimes." 3 dots appeared immediately. Then another message. "Mommy said people cannot stay forever because it ruins routines." I looked down at those words for a long moment. Ruins routines. Such a neat little phrase. Clean. Organized. Almost harmless. It amazed me how cruelty sounded gentler once people wrapped it in therapy language and soft voices. I thought back over the last few years, and suddenly small moments I had ignored began fitting together like puzzle pieces finally turning the right direction. Melissa insisting they spend Christmas morning alone to build their own traditions. Brian forgetting my birthday dinner because of a work emergency that somehow still allowed him to post restaurant pictures online later that night. The extra chair disappearing from Thanksgiving without explanation. Family photographs where I slowly moved from the center of the frame to the edge until eventually I stopped appearing altogether. None of it happened loudly. That was the strange part. Families rarely announce when they are removing you from the picture. They just keep making less room until one day you realize you are standing outside in the rain holding a suitcase. Around noon, I drove to the storage facility where I kept a few boxes after downsizing last spring. The manager recognized me immediately. "Miss Carter," he said warmly. "How is that granddaughter of yours?" I almost cried right there beside the rolling metal doors simply because somebody sounded genuinely happy to see me. Human hearts become fragile in lonely places. Sometimes kindness feels heavier than cruelty because you forgot what it sounded like. I unlocked my small storage unit and stared at the boxes stacked neatly inside. Christmas decorations, old tax records, Frank's fishing gear, a wooden rocking horse Brian used to ride around the living room pretending he was a cowboy. I reached for one box near the back and found an old photo album tucked beneath a winter blanket. Dust clung to the edges. I sat down slowly on the concrete floor and opened it. There was Brian at 16 smiling beside his first used car after I worked double shifts at the library for months to help him afford insurance payments. Brian at 23 asleep in my guest room after his first serious breakup. Brian at 30 standing beside Melissa on their wedding day while I adjusted her veil before the ceremony because her own mother arrived late from the airport. I turned page after page until one photograph finally stopped me completely. It was taken 10 years ago in front of the very house where Brian had turned me away. The mortgage company had threatened foreclosure after his business collapsed. He looked exhausted back then. Thin. Ashamed. I remembered sitting across from him at my kitchen table while he admitted he might lose everything. "I failed," he whispered that night. And I remembered reaching across the table to hold his trembling hands while I promised him he had not failed because he still had family. I closed the album carefully and stared at the storage unit walls around me. Somewhere between that moment and this one, my son had learned how to accept sacrifice without remembering the person who made it. That evening the rain finally stopped, but the air still carried that damp November chill that settles into your bones after sunset. I returned to the motel with the photo album resting carefully on the passenger seat beside me like something fragile enough to break under sudden movement. The neon vacancy sign buzzed softly outside room 16, while a man in work boots smoked beside the ice machine across the parking lot. Everything smelled faintly of wet pavement and old coffee. Temporary places always carry the scent of people passing through them too quickly. I unlocked the motel room and set the album on the bed before turning on the lamp near the window. The light flickered twice before holding steady. For dinner, I heated canned soup in the microwave and ate it slowly with a plastic spoon while local weather updates droned from the television. Another storm expected Sunday night. Temperatures dropping into the 30s. I found myself wondering whether Brian had remembered to bring Lucy's winter coat in from the garage. The thought irritated me more than it should have. Even after everything, part of me still moved automatically toward caring for people who no longer cared for me the same way. My phone buzzed around 8:15. I looked down expecting another message from Lucy, but instead Melissa's name appeared on the screen for the first time since the night on the porch. I stared at it long enough for the call to stop before a text arrived seconds later. "Brian feels bad about how things happened. We just need space right now while everything is stressful." I read the message twice. Not once did she ask where I was staying. Not once did she ask if I had enough money or whether I had eaten dinner. Just space. Such a clean little word for emotional distance. I placed the phone face down on the nightstand and looked toward the motel curtains, shifting slightly from the heater beneath the window. Frank used to say people revealed themselves most clearly when inconvenience entered the room. Anyone could act loving during holidays and birthday dinners. Real character showed up when sacrifice became uncomfortable. Around 9 o'clock, another message appeared. This time it was Lucy again. "Grandma, can I call you?" I answered immediately. Her small voice came through the speaker in a whisper. "Are you at a hotel?" she asked quietly. "Just for a little while, sweetheart." I heard muffled sounds in the background. Cabinet doors closing. A television somewhere downstairs. "Mommy said grown-ups need privacy," Lucy said. "But Grandpa Frank let Uncle Tommy live with you for 6 months when he lost his job." I closed my eyes for a moment. Children notice everything adults think they are hiding. "That was a long time ago," I answered gently. "Did Dad hurt your feelings?" The question landed softly, but it still hurt. Not because Lucy asked it, because she was the only one brave enough to. I looked down at my hands resting in my lap. Age spots across my knuckles. Thin silver veins beneath pale skin. Hands that packed school lunches for decades. Hands that held Brian through fevers and heartbreak and fear. "Sometimes people do not realize they are hurting someone until much later," I finally said. Lucy grew quiet for a second. Then she whispered, "I think he knows." My chest tightened unexpectedly. In the background, I suddenly heard Melissa's voice calling from another room. "Lucy, bedtime." "I have to go," she whispered quickly. "But Grandma." "Yes, sweetheart. I still want you at my birthday dinner next week." The call ended before I could answer. I sat there staring at the dark television screen long after her voice disappeared. Birthday dinner. I had almost forgotten. Lucy was turning 11 next Thursday. Last year she asked for books instead of toys, because she said books made her feel less lonely at school. Melissa laughed at the comment back then and called her dramatic. But I remembered the look on Lucy's face afterward. Some children inherit sensitivity the same way others inherit eye color. I opened the photo album again and slowly turned pages while the heater rattled beside the bed. There was Melissa smiling at their engagement party 10 years earlier. Blonde hair curled neatly around her shoulders. Bright white dress. One hand resting possessively on Brian's arm even then. I remembered trying so hard to welcome her into the family. I hosted bridal showers. Helped address invitations. Gave them my grandmother's china set as a wedding gift, even though part of me wanted to keep it for sentimental reasons. Back then, Melissa hugged me tightly and called me her second mother. Funny how quickly affection disappears once people no longer need something from you. I paused at another photograph taken 5 years ago during Christmas dinner. Everyone sat around my dining room table wearing paper crowns from holiday crackers. Brian smiled while carving ham. Lucy sat beside Frank laughing, with mashed potatoes on her cheek. Melissa held a wine glass near her chest while glancing toward the camera with polite perfection. At first glance it looked like happiness. But now I noticed something else. I was the only one serving food. The only one standing. The only one making sure everyone else felt comfortable. Women like me often spend so much time creating warmth for others that we never notice nobody is creating any for us in return. My eyes drifted toward the motel mirror across the room. The woman staring back looked smaller somehow than she had a week ago. Not weaker, just more aware. I suddenly remembered something Frank once told me after Brian turned 16 and started pulling away the way teenage boys often do. "Do not spend your whole life begging to stay important to someone," he said while we washed dishes together one quiet Sunday evening. "The people who love you should make room for you naturally." At the time I thought he was talking about parenting. Sitting alone in that motel room years later, I finally understood he was talking about dignity. The next morning arrived cold and painfully clear after 3 straight days of rain. Sunlight spilled across the motel parking lot in pale strips, while frost clung to the edges of windshields like thin white lace. I woke before dawn because older people often do when stress settles too heavily in their chest. The heater had shut itself off sometime during the night, and the room felt so cold that I could see my breath faintly near the window. For a few seconds I forgot where I was. Then I saw the plastic motel key card beside the lamp and remembered everything all over again. I dressed slowly and drove toward the public library downtown because I needed somewhere quiet that did not smell like cigarettes and stale carpet. Libraries had always calmed me. 32 years working among shelves and whispered conversations leaves something permanent in your soul. The building opened at 9, and the young woman at the front desk smiled politely when I walked in carrying my purse and winter coat. Nobody there knew I had nowhere permanent to sleep. That small anonymity felt comforting somehow. I settled into a chair near the history section with a cup of coffee from the lobby machine and opened my phone to check messages. Nothing from Brian. Nothing from Melissa. Only another text from Lucy sent late the night before after I had fallen asleep. "I miss Grandpa today." I stared at those words for a long moment. Frank and Lucy had adored each other. Every Saturday morning they used to make pancakes together while she stood on a kitchen stool, wearing one of his old baseball caps that slipped down over her eyes. After Frank died 3 years ago, Lucy cried harder at the funeral than some adults did. Children understand loss differently. They do not hide from it the way grown people try to. Around 11, my phone finally rang. Brian's name flashed across the screen. For 1 weak, hopeful second, my heart reacted before my pride could stop it. I answered quietly. "Hello." His voice sounded distracted, like somebody multitasking during a business call. "Hey, Mom." Not "Mom, are you okay?" Not "Mom, where are you staying?" Just "Hey." I wanted to check if the apartment situation got resolved yet. I looked out the library window toward passing traffic. A woman walked by pushing a stroller while holding a little boy's mittened hand. "Not yet," I answered. The repairs may take another week or two. Silence stretched briefly between us. I could almost hear him deciding how compassionate he was willing to sound. That is rough, he finally said. Have you looked into short-term rentals? Short-term rentals. As though I were discussing vacation plans instead of homelessness at 71 years old. I am managing, I said carefully. Lucy told me she spoke to you. Another pause. Yeah. Melissa thinks maybe it is better if she does not get too involved in adult issues right now. I closed my eyes slowly. There it was again. That careful, polished language people use when they want to avoid saying the ugly truth plainly. She is your daughter, Brian, I said softly. Not a coworker at a human resources meeting. He exhaled sharply through his nose. Mom, please do not make this harder than it already is. Harder. I almost laughed at the word, as though emotional inconvenience belonged primarily to him. I never wanted to be a problem, I answered. Well, Melissa feels like you blame her for everything. I looked down at my coffee cup resting between my hands. The cardboard sleeve had started peeling at the edges. Do you? I asked quietly. He hesitated too long before answering. It is complicated. No, it was not complicated. That was the saddest part. A son either opens the door for his elderly mother during a crisis, or he does not. Everything else is decoration around the truth. I should go, he muttered finally. I have meetings all afternoon. Meetings. There was always another meeting. Another obligation. Another reason family slowly became something squeezed into leftover corners of his life. Of course, I said gently. Take care of yourself. He sounded relieved when the conversation ended quickly. I sat there staring at my dark phone screen long after the call disconnected. Around me, pages turned softly. Someone coughed near the computers. The ordinary, peaceful sounds of people existing beside one another without cruelty. I suddenly remembered another afternoon inside this same library nearly 20 years earlier when Brian lost his first real job. He showed up unexpectedly during my lunch break wearing the same defeated expression he carried after his father died. We sat together near the large windows overlooking Maple Street while he admitted he felt ashamed for failing at adulthood. You are not failing, I told him back then while slipping cash quietly into his coat pocket because I knew he could not afford groceries that week. People who love each other help carry heavy seasons. He cried in front of me that day without embarrassment because sons still trust their mothers completely when they are young enough to need saving. Somewhere along the way, adulthood taught him a different lesson. It taught him that independence mattered more than loyalty, that comfort mattered more than sacrifice, that aging parents slowly become emotional clutter to organize neatly out of daily life. By late afternoon, sunlight stretched gold across the library carpet, and I realized something unsettling as I packed my things to leave. During every conversation since the flood, Brian kept speaking as though my presence threatened the peace inside his house. Not once had he spoken as though my absence hurt it. And perhaps that was the real grief hidden beneath all the others. Not losing my apartment, not sleeping in a motel, but realizing my son no longer experienced my love as something valuable enough to miss. By Saturday morning, the motel room no longer felt temporary. That frightened me more than anything else. Human beings can adapt to almost any sadness if it repeats long enough. I woke to the sound of tires hissing across wet pavement outside and stared at the water stains spreading faintly across the ceiling above the bed. 3 nights had passed since Brian closed the door on me, yet my body had already begun learning the rhythms of this place. The ice machine outside room 12 rattled every morning around 6. The woman next door coughed loudly before leaving for work at 7:30. The motel coffee ran out by 9 unless you arrived early. Strange how quickly loneliness builds routines around itself. I spent most of the morning walking through a nearby shopping plaza simply because I could not stand another hour inside the room. Christmas decorations hung from storefront windows, while speakers hidden somewhere above the sidewalks played soft instrumental carols too early in the season. Families carried shopping bags between stores. Couples argued gently over parking spaces. Teenagers laughed near the pretzel stand. Everybody seemed connected to someone else through invisible threads of belonging. I stopped in front of a department store window displaying winter blankets and suddenly remembered the quilt I made for Brian when he first moved into that house 10 years earlier. Navy blue with stitched white lines because he once told me the colors reminded him of the Yankees. I spent nearly 4 months sewing it by hand while listening to old jazz records in my apartment. Melissa thanked me politely at the time, but 6 months later, I noticed the blanket folded inside their guest room closet, still wrapped in tissue paper like something unwanted. Back then, I told myself she probably forgot about it. Mothers become experts at translating rejection into harmless explanations. Around noon, my phone buzzed with a social media notification. I almost ignored it until Lucy's profile picture caught my attention. She had posted photographs from her school choir concert the night before. In the first picture, she stood on stage wearing a green sweater and holding sheet music against her chest. In the second picture, Brian and Melissa smiled beside her in the auditorium lobby under strings of white lights. My stomach tightened when I realized nobody had told me about the concert. Again, I sat down slowly on a bench outside the pharmacy while cold wind pushed dead leaves across the sidewalk around my shoes. This was how it always happened now. Events occurring quietly beyond the edges of my life while everyone else acted as though my absence was natural. I scrolled farther down and froze when I saw Melissa's latest post beneath the photos. Protecting your peace sometimes means setting difficult boundaries, even with family. Grateful for the life we are building together. Hundreds of people would read that sentence and think she sounded wise, mature, emotionally healthy. None of them would picture a 71-year-old widow eating vending machine crackers alone in a roadside motel after being turned away during a flood. Language can hide cruelty so elegantly these days. I stared at the screen long enough for the words to blur slightly before locking the phone and slipping it back into my purse. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of crying, I felt tired. Deeply tired. Not the kind of exhaustion sleep fixes. The kind that comes from carrying emotional weight for too many years without realizing how heavy it became. Suddenly, memories surfaced one after another with uncomfortable clarity. Melissa changing dinner plans whenever I visited. Brian shortening phone calls whenever she entered the room. Invitations arriving later and later until eventually they stopped arriving at all unless Lucy insisted. It had not started with the flood. The flood merely exposed what already existed beneath the surface. By late afternoon, I returned to the motel and found an envelope slid beneath my door. For a brief, hopeful second, I thought maybe Brian had come by. But the handwriting belonged to the apartment management office. Estimated repairs delayed further due to structural inspection requirements. Minimum additional 10 business days. I sat slowly on the edge of the bed, holding the letter in both hands while silence filled the room around me. 10 more days. Outside, headlights moved across the curtains as evening traffic thickened near the interstate. My phone rang unexpectedly a few minutes later. This time it was not Brian. It was Martha Reynolds, Frank's old attorney's assistant. I had not spoken to her since the funeral. "Helen," she said warmly, "I heard about the flooding downtown from the news and thought of you immediately." The simple concern in her voice nearly unraveled me. "I am managing," I answered automatically. "Well," she replied gently, "you always say that even when you should not have to." I smiled sadly at the familiar truth of it. She hesitated before speaking again. "I ran into Brian last month at the courthouse. He mentioned refinancing the house." My grip tightened slightly around the motel letter. Refinancing. Yes. He needed copies of some older property records tied to Frank's estate. "I assumed you knew." I stared toward the motel window while something cold and unsettling moved quietly through my chest. Frank's estate. Old property records. Suddenly, I remembered that kitchen table conversation 10 years ago after Brian nearly lost everything. The bank threatening foreclosure. The panic in his voice. The check I wrote from Frank's retirement account after selling the lake cabin Frank loved most in the world. Melissa never knew where the money came from because Brian begged me not to tell her how desperate things had become. "I cannot let her think I failed," he whispered back then. So I protected his pride, just like mothers always do. Martha continued speaking softly on the phone while a realization slowly settled over me with uncomfortable weight. The house Brian protected so fiercely from my presence might not even still belong entirely to him. Sunday arrived sharp and bright after the storm, the kind of cold autumn morning where every sound seems clearer than usual. Church bells echoed faintly through downtown as I drove toward the small office building where Martha Reynolds still worked 3 days a week handling estate paperwork. Frost glittered along the edges of lawns and rooftops while thin smoke curled from chimneys in quiet suburban neighborhoods. People carried casserole dishes and children in polished shoes into churches with red brick steps and stained glass windows. For a moment, I remembered all the Sunday mornings Frank and I spent raising Brian inside routines that felt permanent back then. Pancakes before church, football games afterward, family dinners around the oak table we saved for nearly 2 years to afford. We built our entire lives believing love naturally created loyalty. I parked beside the courthouse and sat quietly in the car for a few extra minutes before going inside. The steering wheel felt cold beneath my palms. Somewhere across town, Brian and Melissa were probably sitting in church pews listening to sermons about kindness and compassion while pretending nothing uncomfortable existed beyond the edges of their carefully organized life. The thought no longer made me angry, just older somehow. Martha greeted me warmly the second I entered her office. She looked nearly the same as she had during Frank's funeral. Gray curls pinned neatly behind one ear, reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. The scent of peppermint tea lingering softly around her desk. "Helen," she said gently, squeezing my hand. "You look tired." I smiled politely because women my age learn early that admitting exhaustion rarely changes anything. She motioned for me to sit before pulling several folders from a filing cabinet near the wall. "I should probably explain what I meant yesterday," she said carefully. Sunlight stretched across the office carpet while she adjusted papers on her desk. 10 years ago, when Brian faced foreclosure after the business collapse, Frank's estate covered a substantial portion of the refinancing agreement. I stared at her quietly. Hearing the truth spoken aloud felt different somehow than merely remembering pieces of it alone. "Brian asked us to structure everything privately," Martha continued. "He was embarrassed, especially after Melissa had just moved into the house." Embarrassed. Such a small word for the amount of sacrifice hidden beneath it. Martha slid one document carefully across the desk toward me. "Frank specifically insisted your name remain connected to the property through the trust." I looked down at the papers. Legal language blurred slightly beneath my eyes while one sentence stood out sharply above everything else. "Secondary beneficiary and partial equity holder." My fingers tightened slowly around the edge of the document. "Brian knows this?" I asked quietly. Martha hesitated just long enough to answer the question before speaking. "He does." The room suddenly felt very still. Outside the office window, a city bus groaned to a stop at the curb while people climbed aboard carrying shopping bags and winter coats. Ordinary life continuing while something inside me shifted permanently into clarity. Brian had known. The entire time he stood in that doorway refusing me shelter during a flood, he knew the roof above his head partially existed because Frank and I sacrificed for him. Worse than that, he knew Frank deliberately protected my future inside those legal documents because somewhere deep down my husband understood something about human nature that I had spent years trying not to see. "There is more," Martha said softly. She opened another folder and removed a handwritten letter folded carefully inside clear protective plastic. My breath caught the moment I recognized Frank's handwriting. Thick, uneven blue ink, slanting slightly upward across the page. "He left this with the trust records," Martha explained. "He said it should only be shown if circumstances ever became difficult between you and Brian regarding the house." My chest tightened painfully as I unfolded the letter with trembling hands. "Helen, if you are reading this, then something has gone wrong in ways I hoped never would. I know our son loves deeply, but sometimes people become so afraid of losing comfort that they forget who protected them during hard seasons. Do not ever beg for space in a home your sacrifices helped build. A family that truly loves you will make room before you ask." I stopped reading for a moment because tears finally blurred the page completely. Not loud dramatic tears, just quiet ones slipping down my face while years of confusion slowly settled into painful understanding. Frank knew. Maybe not specifically about this moment, but he understood the possibility of it. He understood how easily gratitude fades once comfort becomes permanent. Martha handed me a tissue gently across the desk. "There is something else you should know," she said. "Brian came here last month trying to refinance again without involving the trust documentation. He seemed nervous when we explained your signature would still be legally required." I looked up sharply. "He never mentioned any of that to me." "No," Martha answered quietly. He did not. Silence filled the office for several long seconds. Then, unexpectedly, I laughed softly through my tears. Not because anything felt funny, because suddenly everything made terrible sense. The discomfort whenever I visited, the careful distance, Melissa's obsession with boundaries and privacy and protecting their peace. My existence complicated the story they preferred telling themselves. Successful independent adults building a perfect life together. There was no comfortable place inside that narrative for an aging mother who quietly helped save the house they lived in. I folded Frank's letter carefully and held it against my chest for a moment. The paper felt warm from my hands. Outside, church bells rang again somewhere across town, while sunlight spilled brighter through the office windows. And for the first time since the flood began, I no longer felt confused about where I stood in my son's life. The uncertainty was gone now. What remained hurt deeply, but at least it was honest. Lucy's birthday dinner took place Thursday evening at Brian's house beneath strings of soft golden lights wrapped around the porch railing. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke and cinnamon from nearby chimneys as I parked along the curb and sat quietly inside my Buick for a moment watching warm shadows move across the front windows. I almost did not come. After everything that happened, part of me wanted to disappear quietly from their lives before they could push me any farther away. But then I remembered Lucy's voice whispering through the motel phone asking if I would still come. Children should not have to pay for the emotional failures of adults. I stepped out carrying a neatly wrapped gift bag and the brown leather folder Martha helped me organize 2 days earlier. Inside rested copies of the trust documents, the refinancing records, and Frank's handwritten letter folded carefully at the very top. The folder felt strangely light considering how much truth it contained. When I walked up the front steps, the porch light flickered on automatically, just as it had the night Brian turned me away. Funny how the same house could feel so different depending on whether people expected you or merely tolerated your presence. Melissa opened the door wearing a cream sweater dress and a practiced smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Helen," she said politely, "Lucy will be excited you made it." Made it. As though attending my granddaughter's birthday required overcoming traffic instead of humiliation. Inside, the dining room glowed warmly beneath candles and hanging paper decorations shaped like silver stars. Lucy ran toward me immediately the moment she saw me near the doorway. "Grandma." She wrapped both arms tightly around my waist while the scent of strawberry shampoo drifted from her hair. I closed my eyes briefly and held her close. Children hug with their entire heart before life teaches them restraint. "Happy birthday, sweetheart," I whispered. Brian stood near the kitchen island speaking with 2 neighbors from down the street. The second our eyes met, an uncomfortable stiffness crossed his face. Not anger, guilt. He walked over carrying a glass of iced tea in one hand. "Mom," he said quietly, "glad you could come." The sentence sounded careful, measured, like somebody stepping around broken glass barefoot. "I would not miss Lucy's birthday," I answered gently. For a few moments, everything almost resembled normal life again. Lucy opened presents while music played softly from a speaker near the fireplace. A chocolate cake waited untouched on the kitchen counter beside bowls of ice cream toppings. Neighbors laughed politely at small talk involving school schedules and holiday travel plans. Melissa moved gracefully between guests, refilling drinks and adjusting decorations with the calm efficiency of someone deeply invested in appearances. But beneath all of it, tension lingered quietly inside the room like static before lightning. I noticed how Brian avoided standing too close to me. How Melissa never fully relaxed whenever our eyes met. Truth changes the atmosphere even before anyone speaks it aloud. During dinner, Lucy asked if I would help her with the school book fair next month like I always used to. Before I could answer, Melissa smiled tightly and set down her wine glass. "We are trying to simplify schedules moving forward," she said lightly. "Things have been emotionally overwhelming lately." The table grew quieter. Brian focused suddenly on cutting his chicken into careful pieces without looking up. I felt something inside me finally settle into calm. Not sadness anymore. Clarity. Emotionally overwhelming for whom? I asked softly. Melissa blinked once. "Excuse me. You keep speaking as though kindness creates hardship," I answered. "I am trying to understand who exactly has suffered from my presence." The room became completely still except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. One of the neighbors shifted awkwardly in his chair. Brian finally looked up sharply. Mom, this is not the time. But Lucy stared between us with wide, anxious eyes, and suddenly I realized something important. Silence had protected the wrong people long enough. I reached beside my chair and lifted the brown leather folder onto the table. Melissa's expression changed instantly. Not fear exactly. More like irritation that discomfort had entered her carefully managed evening. What is that? Brian asked quietly. I opened the folder slowly and removed the first document. The refinancing agreement from 10 years ago, I said. The one connected to this house. Brian's face lost color almost immediately. Melissa frowned in confusion while I continued speaking calmly. Frank's estate paid a significant portion of your mortgage when the bank threatened foreclosure after your business collapsed. Melissa turned toward Brian sharply. What is she talking about? He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Lucy looked between all of us, silently clutching her fork. I slid the second document across the table toward Melissa. My name remains legally connected to the property through the trust, I explained gently. Which means the home I was not welcome to stay inside during a flood partially exists because Frank and I sacrificed to save it. Nobody moved. Even the music from the speaker seemed suddenly too loud inside the silence. Brian rubbed both hands across his face slowly while Melissa stared down at the paperwork with growing disbelief. You told me your father helped with the down payment, she whispered. Brian swallowed hard without answering. I reached into the folder one final time and unfolded Frank's handwritten letter carefully before placing it beside Lucy's birthday plate. Your grandfather wrote this years ago, I told her softly. He wanted our family to remember something important. Lucy picked up the letter with small, trembling hands and began reading aloud while every adult at that table sat frozen beneath the warm golden lights of the house they thought belonged entirely to them. Lucy's voice trembled slightly as she read Frank's letter aloud beneath the dining room lights. The paper shook softly in her small hands while every adult at the table sat frozen in the kind of silence that only truth can create. A family that truly loves you will make room before you ask, she finished quietly. For a long moment nobody moved. The candles flickered gently beside the birthday cake, while silver star decorations turned slowly in the warm air from the heating vents overhead. Outside the front window, snow had begun falling in soft, uneven flakes beneath the porch light. Brian stared down at the table with both hands pressed tightly together like he was holding himself upright through force alone. Melissa looked pale for the first time since I had known her. Not angry anymore. Not defensive. Just stunned by the realization that the story she believed about their perfect, independent life had cracks running through it for years. Lucy carefully folded the letter and looked toward her father with wet eyes. Grandpa helped save our house? She asked softly. Brian swallowed hard before finally nodding once. Yes. His voice barely rose above a whisper. And Grandma too. Another pause. Longer this time. Yes. He answered again without lifting his eyes. Lucy stared at him in silence for several seconds before pushing her chair back gently from the table. Then why was Grandma alone in a motel? Nobody answered her. Because there was no answer that could survive a child's honesty. Melissa looked toward me slowly. Helen, she began carefully. We did not know things would become this serious after the flood. I met her gaze calmly across the table. No, I replied softly. You just knew I had nowhere else to go. The room fell silent again. One of the neighbors quietly stood and muttered something about it getting late before guiding his wife toward the door. The other guests followed soon afterward with uncomfortable smiles and quick goodbyes until only family remained beneath the soft golden lights and half-eaten birthday cake. Brian finally looked up at me fully for the first time in days. His eyes looked exhausted. Older somehow. Mom, he said quietly, I was overwhelmed. Everything has been stressful lately, and I handled it badly. Strange how people describe betrayal once consequences arrive. I nodded slowly because arguing no longer interested me. I believe you were stressed, I answered gently. But stress does not create character. It reveals it. He flinched slightly at that. Lucy walked quietly around the table and slipped her small hand into mine. Grandma can stay here now, she said firmly while looking at her parents. The innocence in her voice nearly broke something inside me. Brian rubbed both hands across his face and exhaled shakily. Of course she can. The words arrived too late. Not because my pride demanded punishment. Because something fundamental had already changed inside me. A home stops feeling safe once you realize your welcome depends entirely on convenience. I squeezed Lucy's hand gently before standing from the table. That is kind of you, I said softly. But I already found another place. Brian looked startled. What? There is a small apartment near the coast about 40 minutes from here, I explained. Month-to-month lease. Nothing fancy, but it has large windows facing the water. Melissa blinked in surprise. You already signed something? Yesterday afternoon. The truth was I signed it barely 2 hours before coming to the birthday dinner. A quiet little apartment above a bookstore in a coastal town where nobody knew me as somebody's burden. Somewhere with sea air and walking paths and mornings that belonged only to me. Brian stood abruptly from his chair. Mom, please do not do this. I looked at my son carefully then. Really looked at him. Gray beginning near his temples. Worry lines beside his mouth. The same blue eyes Frank passed down to him, now filled with guilt too heavy to hide anymore. For a brief, painful second, I saw every version of him at once. The frightened little boy during thunderstorms. The grieving son at Frank's funeral. The exhausted young father carrying Lucy asleep from the car after long drives home. Loving him had never stopped being easy. The hard part was accepting that love does not always guarantee safety. I am not punishing you, Brian, I said quietly. I am simply no longer waiting for permission to belong somewhere. Tears filled his eyes then. Real ones this time. I never wanted you to feel unwanted. I smiled sadly. That is the problem with silence. People convince themselves they never said the thing their actions repeated clearly. Snow continued drifting outside, while the house settled softly around us with familiar creaks and humming pipes. The same house Frank and I helped save all those years ago because we believed family meant protecting each other during difficult seasons. Maybe we were right. Maybe Brian simply forgot for a while what being protected feels like. Lucy wrapped her arms around me tightly before I reached for my coat. Will you still come visit me? She whispered. I kissed the top of her head gently. Always. Brian followed me quietly to the front door while I slipped on my gloves. The porch light glowed warm against the falling snow exactly as it had the night. Everything changed between us. He stood there beside me looking suddenly unsure of himself in his own doorway. Mom, he said softly as I stepped outside. I am sorry. I believed he meant it. That was the saddest part of all. Some apologies arrive only after love has already learned how to survive without them. I walked slowly toward my Buick while snowflakes settled across my coat sleeves, and the cold ocean town waited somewhere beyond the highway. Behind me the porch light remained on this time, casting long golden shadows across the snow-covered driveway. But I did not turn around. Because for the first time in years, I finally understood something Frank tried to teach me long ago. The people who truly value your presence never force you to stand outside wondering whether you are allowed to come in.